I didn't check my phone until the bailiff called the room to order. That was the precise moment I finally looked down and saw it. A text message from my mother sent 47 minutes earlier while I was still parking my car in the courthouse garage. It read, "I hope you know what you're doing because I don't think you do." I turned my phone face down on the table, smoothed the front of my jacket, and waited. She was sitting 12 feet away from me. I could feel her looking, that heavy, scrutinizing gaze that had weighed on me for decades, but I didn't look back. That is where this story ends. But to understand why I was sitting at that table, why my mother was sitting on the other side of the aisle, and why a federal courtroom in Charlotte, North Carolina, had become the place where 23 years of silence finally broke open, you have to go back much further than that morning. You have to go back to the kitchen of a house in Greensboro, to a Tuesday in November, to a woman standing at the stove with her back turned, and a 12-year-old girl waiting to be noticed. If you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever been overlooked by the people who were supposed to see you first, or if you have ever dreamed of the day when your hard work and quiet resilience would finally speak louder than the doubts of others, then hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Get comfortable, because what you are about to hear is a story of patience, precision, and the kind of justice that doesn't just settle a score, it redefines a life. My mother is a remarkable woman. I want to say that clearly, and I want to mean it because I do. She is sharp and capable, the kind of person who built a life from very little. She raised 2 daughters mostly on her own after my father left, and she did it without asking anyone for help, which she considered a point of pride. She worked as an office manager for a dental practice for 19 years. She kept the house clean. She kept the lights on. She showed up. She just never showed up for me the way she showed up for my sister. My sister Lauren is 4 years older than me. She is blonde where I am dark-haired, easy where I am serious, warm where I tend toward careful. Lauren has always been the kind of person who fills a room without trying. People just want to be near her. My mother wanted to be near her. That's not a criticism. It's just a fact I learned to hold very early, like a smooth stone in your pocket that you rub until your thumb is raw. Lauren got the long phone calls. Lauren got the advice about boys and careers and what to wear to an interview. When Lauren graduated from community college, my mother took a full week off work and threw her a party with a catered buffet and a banner she hung herself. Streaming crepe paper across the backyard like celebration was something you could buy by the yard. When I graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with a degree in political science, my mother came to the ceremony, sat in the bleachers, took one photo on a disposable camera she'd bought at CVS, and said on the drive home that she hoped I had a plan because she couldn't support me indefinitely. I was 22. I had already been accepted to law school. I hadn't told her yet. I don't know why I hadn't told her. Maybe I was waiting to see if she would ask. She didn't ask. There were small moments I cataloged without meaning to, the way you catalog things when you're young and the people around you are still your whole world. The time I won a writing award in 8th grade and came home with the certificate, my face flushed with the rare thrill of being the best at something, and my mother said, "That's nice," and immediately turned to ask Lauren about her shift at the restaurant. The time I made the varsity debate team as a sophomore, and my mother told her coworker about it secondhand weeks later as though she just remembered. "Oh, my daughter does that debate thing." A casual dismissal of the hours I spent poring over legal briefs and practicing my enunciation in the mirror. The time I called from my college dorm at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night because I was overwhelmed and didn't know what to do about a professor who had graded me unfairly, a professor who had taken pleasure in tearing apart my thesis in front of the class. I needed my mother to tell me it would be okay, that I was smart, that I mattered. She listened for 4 minutes, the sound of the television droning in the background, and then she said she had to get up early. I stopped calling after that. Not entirely, but I stopped calling for the things that mattered. I learned to filter my life before presenting it to her, stripping away the vulnerabilities and the triumphs that might require too much emotional labor on her part, offering her only the sanitized, beige version of my existence. I should explain something about the house because the house matters. My grandmother, my mother's mother, owned a property on the outskirts of Winston-Salem that had been in the family for 3 generations. It wasn't a mansion. It was a white farmhouse on about 4 acres with a detached garage and a barn that hadn't held animals in 30 years. But it was solid and it was paid off, and it sat on land that had appreciated significantly over the decades as the city crept outward. That house was the only place where the air felt breathable to me. It was the place where the silence wasn't heavy with judgment. It was peaceful, a companion rather than a cage. My grandmother, who everyone called Gran, was a quietly perceptive woman who saw her family with clear eyes. She knew my mother favored Lauren. She never said so directly, but she compensated in the way that people who can't speak a thing out loud often do, through action, through presence, through the way she'd find reasons to call me specifically, to ask about my coursework, to remember details my mother routinely forgot. Gran remembered that I liked Earl Grey tea, not chamomile. She remembered the name of my favorite professor from freshman year. She remembered the date of every exam I told her about, and she would text me the morning of just 2 words. "You're ready." She was not a woman who used many words. Those 2 were enough. Gran came to my law school graduation. She drove 4 hours alone at age 79 because my mother had a conflict that weekend. I no longer remember what it was, something to do with Lauren, I'm sure, but Gran sat in the front row of the outdoor ceremony and she cried. Not a polite cry, a real one, her shoulders shaking, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief that had seen better days. Afterwards, she took me to dinner at a restaurant that was too expensive for either of our budgets, and she said, "I want you to know that I see you. I have always seen you, and I want you to remember that when things get hard, because they will." I was 25. I was finishing my first year of law school. I didn't know yet what she meant or what she was preparing me for. I thought she was talking about the law, about the difficulty of the bar exam or the grueling hours of a junior associate. She wasn't. She was talking about them. She was talking about the slow, hollowing realization that the people who are supposed to love you sometimes don't know how to. She died 14 months later on a Thursday morning in March, peacefully in her own bed. It was a quiet ending for a quiet woman, but the aftermath was a thunderclap. She left the house to me. Not to both of us, not split between my mother and Lauren and me, but to me specifically in a will that had been drafted by an estate attorney, properly witnessed, filed with the county, and I would later learn, updated twice in the final 3 years of her life. The most recent version was dated 11 months before she died. Gran had also left Lauren a cash amount that was meaningful, enough for a down payment on a starter home, and she'd left my mother her jewelry collection, which had genuine sentimental and some monetary value. Neither of them walked away with nothing, but the house, the land, the structure, the deed, the foundation of our family history. It went to me. I found out the morning after the funeral when Gran's attorney called my cell phone and asked me to come in at my earliest convenience. I didn't tell my mother or Lauren before I went. I told myself I was waiting until I knew the full details, but if I'm honest, I think part of me already understood that this information would change things, and I was taking one last day of ordinary life before it did. I was right about that. My mother's reaction was not rage. That would have been easier, in some ways easier to absorb and respond to. Rage is hot, it burns out, or you can fight fire with fire. What she gave me instead was a coldness that settled in so completely and so quickly that I wondered, in the days that followed, whether it had always been there and I simply hadn't seen it clearly before. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She sat at her kitchen table with her hands folded and she said very evenly, "Your grandmother always did have a soft spot for you that she couldn't justify." It wasn't an accusation, exactly. It was a verdict. Lauren cried. That was harder. Lauren had not expected anything. She would tell me this later, genuinely, and I believed her. She was not greedy, she was just. Lauren, she was used to things flowing toward her, and this was an anomaly. But watching her cry made me feel like I had done something to her, which was not logical but was very real. "It's not that I think you don't deserve it," Lauren said on the phone 2 days after. It's the house, you know? It's Gran's house." I knew. I knew what she meant, and I felt the weight of it, and I also knew, with the same precision I brought to everything in my life, that Gran had made a deliberate choice with full mental clarity and legal counsel, and that her choice deserved to be honored. I said as much carefully to my mother. She said, "We'll see." Those 2 words turned out to be more of a forecast than I understood at the time. I want to be clear about what happened in the months between Gran's death and the morning I sat in that Charlotte courtroom, because this is not a story about a dramatic, sudden rupture. It's a story about a slow erosion, the kind that happens so gradually you keep adjusting and adjusting until one day you look around and you're standing in a completely different place than where you started. I finished law school. I passed the bar on my first attempt. I took a position with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Charlotte, which was where I'd built my connections during a second-year internship, and I moved into an apartment across town from my mother, which had always been the plan. My mother stopped calling. Not entirely, not in a way she could be accused of, not in a way that would look bad if described to someone else. She called on birthdays. She called at Christmas. She called when Lauren had news, but the texture of the relationship changed. The calls were brief and transactional, and we both pretended this was normal. Lauren navigated the space between us with the exhausted diplomacy of someone who has been doing it her whole life. She invited me to things. I came. My mother and I sat in the same rooms and spoke to each other, and no one watching would have known anything was wrong, but something was wrong. It had been wrong for a long time. The house just made it visible. I kept working. That was the thing I knew how to do. In the office, I was methodical and thorough, and the senior attorneys trusted me with cases that required precision, and I delivered. I built a record. I built a reputation quietly, in the way I built everything, without announcing it, without seeking validation, just putting one careful brick on top of another. I thought about Gran sometimes during those months. I thought about sitting on her back porch in the evenings when I was in high school, the summer I'd spent 3 weeks with her after a particularly difficult year at home. She'd let me be quiet. She'd never asked me to perform happiness I didn't feel. She'd made oatmeal every morning and left it on the stove, and when I came downstairs, it was there, and that simple, reliable presence of something warm waiting for me had mattered more than she probably knew. I was building the kind of career she would have understood. Not flashy, not for applause, just solid, verifiable, real. Gran's attorney reached out to me 18 months after the estate settled to ask whether I had any plans for the property because there were tax implications I should be thinking about. I'd been making small payments to maintain it, the utilities, the lawn service, minimal repairs, while I decided what to do. I wasn't ready to sell it. I wasn't sure I ever would be. It was the only place that felt like mine. Then, in the spring of my 3rd year at the U.S. Attorney's Office, my mother filed a legal challenge to Gran's will. Her argument, as presented by the attorney she hired, a man named Gerald Foss who had a local practice and a reputation for aggressive estate disputes, was that Gran had been subject to undue influence in the final years of her life. They claimed I had cultivated a relationship with Gran specifically to position myself as a beneficiary, that the updated will represented not Gran's true wishes, but my manipulation of an elderly woman who had diminished capacity and was isolated from her family. Every word of it was false. I knew it was false. Gran's attorney knew it was false. The 2 witnesses who had signed the will knew it was false. And I knew that my mother knew it was false. But it was filed. It was in the system, and now I had to respond to it. I sat in my apartment the evening I received the formal notification, and I read through the filing twice. The ink seemed to swim on the page, a black tide of accusation. Then I set it on the kitchen table, and I made dinner, and I ate it, and I washed the dishes. I did not call anyone. I did not cry. I had spent enough years managing difficult information to know that the first thing you do is let it settle. Let the initial heat pass, and then you work. I called my colleague Rachel the next morning. Rachel had handled estate litigation before joining the U.S. Attorney's Office, and she agreed without hesitation to represent me formally. We spent 2 evenings that week going through every document, every record, every piece of evidence that existed about Gran's state of mind and our relationship. There was a great deal of it. I had kept everything. Here is what my mother did not know about me, or perhaps chose not to remember. I was, by that point, a federal prosecutor with 3 years of courtroom experience, a 91% conviction rate in the cases I'd handled, and a specialization in financial fraud that required me to dismantle complex legal arguments for a living. I lived in the world of evidence, of burden of proof, of reasonable doubt. She had hired Gerald Foss. Gerald Foss had never tried a case in federal court. I did not tell my mother any of this. I did not tell Lauren. I did not send a message through any channel indicating that I had any particular capacity to defend myself. I made no speeches about who I was or what I did. I filed my response through Rachel, and I waited. 3 months before the hearing, my mother texted me for the first time in 6 weeks. Not about the case, about a birthday party for Lauren's daughter, my niece, who was turning 5. I went to the party. I brought a gift. I sat at a picnic table in Lauren's backyard and watched my niece run through a sprinkler, and I talked to my mother about the weather and the traffic on I-40 and the price of groceries. And when I drove home that evening, I sat in my parking garage for 11 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I thought about calling someone, a friend, maybe, or my college roommate who still checked in occasionally. But I didn't know what I would have said. That I was tired. That the ordinary conversation at the birthday party had cost me something I couldn't name. That I had sat across from my mother and smiled and asked about her garden and felt the entire time like I was watching the scene from a slight distance, unable to close the gap. I went inside. I made tea. I went to bed. The morning of the hearing, I woke at 5:15 without an alarm. I made coffee. I ironed my clothes, a charcoal blazer, dark trousers, a white button-down that I had worn to deliver a closing argument the previous October. I checked my documents twice, though I had checked them the night before and the night before that, and I already knew every page by memory. I drove to the courthouse, and I parked on level 3 of the garage, and I sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel. Then I picked up my phone and saw my mother's text. "I hope you know what you're doing because I don't think you do." I thought about those words for a moment, not with anger, with something closer to sadness. And beneath that, a very old and very familiar recognition. This was who we were to each other. This was the register she used with me, even now, even here. Not cruelty exactly, just the absence of the other thing. I put the phone away. I got out of the car. I took the elevator to the lobby, badged through security, and walked to the courtroom where a judge I had appeared before twice in other matters was already settling in behind the bench. She was the Honorable Patricia Ackafer. She had been on the federal bench for 11 years. She was known, among the attorneys in our office, for 2 things: an encyclopedic memory and very little patience for unprepared counsel. I sat down at the respondent's table. Gerald Foss sat at the petitioner's table, arranging papers with the deliberate unhurry of a man who expected this to be a straightforward day. My mother sat in the gallery 2 rows back. Lauren was beside her. Lauren had not wanted to come. I learned this later, but my mother had asked her to. I did not look at either of them. Gerald Foss opened by painting a picture. He was, I'll give him this, a competent speaker. He had a warm baritone and a measured cadence, and he presented his argument with the practiced ease of someone who had made similar arguments before, in rooms where no one pushed back very hard. The deceased had been elderly and increasingly reliant on my visits, he said. The relationship between granddaughter and grandmother had been warm, yes, but also strategic. He suggested the visits had intensified, notably in the 3 years before death, coinciding precisely with the period in which the will was revised. He implied, without quite saying, that I had identified an asset and pursued it. I watched Judge Ackafer while he spoke. She was writing something on her notepad. She did not look up. When it was my turn, I stood. I introduced myself to the court, not by name, because she knew my name, but by context. I noted my position at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I noted my years of experience in the courtroom. I noted specifically that I had a professional obligation to accuracy and evidence that governed everything I was about to present. Gerald Foss's pen stopped moving. I presented Gran's medical records from the final 4 years of her life, which showed no cognitive decline of any clinical significance whatsoever. I presented the affidavit from her estate attorney, who had worked with her for 22 years, and described her as one of the most clear-minded clients he had ever served. I presented signed statements from both witnesses to the will's final revision, who confirmed the process had been conducted properly and without any outside pressure. I presented for the record the full visitor log from Gran's home and the communications log from my phone, which showed not an intensification of contact during the revision period, but a consistent pattern of weekly calls going back 11 years through college, through law school, through my entire career. I presented a letter Gran had written to me, dated 14 months before her death, in which she explained her decision. She had written it unprompted, in her own hand, and had given it to her estate attorney to hold and release after the will entered probate. I read 3 lines of it aloud, slowly. I know this will cause pain. I have thought about that pain a great deal, but I believe you will use this land as a foundation, and I want you to have a foundation because no one in this family ever gave you one. The courtroom was very quiet. I did not look at my mother when I read those lines. I kept my eyes on Judge Ackafer, the way you keep your eyes on the bench, the way you were trained. But I felt the words land in the room. I felt the particular weight of them settling over the gallery. Judge Ackafer was looking at the letter copy I'd submitted into evidence. She had been looking at it for what felt like a long time. Then she looked up, past me, toward the gallery. "Mr. Foss," she said. She had turned to address my mother's attorney, but her eyes moved briefly, deliberately, over my mother's face. "Before we proceed further, I want to make sure I understand the basis of this claim. You are arguing undue influence on a woman whose attorney of 22 years found no cause for concern, whose medical records show no impairment, and whose communications with the respondent were consistent and longstanding. Is that correct?" Gerald Foss said, "Your Honor, communications is precisely what. I'm asking you to confirm the factual basis of the claim as filed," Judge Ackafer said. "Not to argue it again. The basis, yes or no." A pause. "Yes, Your Honor." She wrote something on her notepad. Then she looked at me. "Counselor," she said. The word landed differently than I expected it to. Not because of what it meant. I had been called counselor in courtrooms before, but because of where it landed in the room. I heard my mother shift in her seat behind me. "You are employed with the U.S. Attorney's Office," Judge Ackafer said. It was not a question. She had clearly already known this. "Yes, Your Honor." "How long?" 3 years and 4 months. She nodded slowly and looked back at my mother. Not at Gerald Foss, at my mother directly. "Ma'am," she said, and her voice was measured and even, but it carried. "Do you understand who has been representing herself in these proceedings?" The silence that followed was different from any silence I had experienced in a courtroom. It was the silence of something that cannot be unsaid, even though nothing had been said yet. My mother said nothing. Judge Ackafer said, "You filed a claim of undue influence against a federal prosecutor with a demonstrated record of ethical conduct and evidentiary rigor, and you expected that claim to succeed." Gerald Foss said, "Your Honor, with respect." "Mr. Foss," she said, "you have submitted a petition that relies almost entirely on inferred motive and circumstantial pattern interpretation against documentation that directly contradicts both. I want you to think very carefully before I ask you my next question." Gerald Foss put down his pen. "Is there anything in the evidentiary record that supports the claim of undue influence that you have not already submitted?" The pause this time was longer. "No, Your Honor." I did not turn around. I kept my eyes forward, but I could hear things behind me. A small sound from Lauren, the creak of a pew bench. My mother's breathing, which I have known my entire life, the way you know the particular sounds of the house where you grew up. Judge Ackafer ruled from the bench. She denied the petition. She found no evidentiary basis for the claim of undue influence. She noted on the record that the documentation submitted by the respondent was thorough and credible, and that the deceased had made her intentions known with unusual clarity and deliberate foresight. She also noted, with what I can only describe as judicial restraint, that parties considering estate challenges would do well to understand the professional background of the individuals they are challenging before proceeding to a hearing. It was the closest thing to a rebuke that her measured language would allow. Court was adjourned at 11:47 in the morning. I gathered my documents. I put them in the correct order, the way I always do, the way they taught us to do in the U.S. Attorney's training program. You leave a courtroom clean, regardless of the outcome, because the next attorney who uses that table deserves a clear space. Rachel caught my eye across the room and gave me a small nod. I nodded back. I turned around. My mother was still sitting in the gallery. Lauren was standing beside her with her coat in her arms and her eyes red. Gerald Foss was at the petitioner's table with his back to the room, packing his briefcase with the efficiency of a man who wants to leave quickly. My mother looked at me. For the first time in a very long time, she looked at me without the particular expression I'd grown up seeing on her face. When she looked at me, that faint habitual assessment, the inventory she seemed to be running, the measurement of what I was and what she expected, and where I had failed to meet the gap between those two things. She just looked at me. I walked toward her because I didn't know what else to do, not because I had something prepared to say. I hadn't prepared anything for this moment, which was unusual for me. I'd prepared everything else. Lauren said my name quietly. I stopped in front of my mother. She said, "I didn't know." I didn't say anything immediately. I let the words sit for a moment, and I thought about what they meant and what they didn't mean. She didn't know I was a federal prosecutor. That part was literally true. She didn't know what I did. She hadn't asked. She hadn't known for 3 years and 4 months because she hadn't asked once. Not once at a birthday call. Not once at Christmas. Not once in the parking lot of Lauren's house after a family dinner. She had asked Lauren about her promotion and her new car and whether she was sleeping enough. She had not asked me what I did when I went to work in the morning. "I know you didn't," I said. "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the party where she'd taken one photo. I thought about the phone calls that stopped. I thought about sitting in my parking garage for 11 minutes because I couldn't make myself go inside. I thought about Gran's letter. The line I hadn't read aloud in court, the next one. The one that came after the 3 I'd read, which said, "She has been invisible to you for so long that she has learned to be invisible to everyone. I hope someday she unlearns that." "You didn't ask," I said. That was all. It was the most honest thing I could offer. Lauren made a sound that was close to a sob, but she held it. My mother's expression shifted. I have replayed that shift many times in the months since, and I still cannot name exactly what moved across her face, whether it was regret or recognition or simply the particular pain of being seen clearly after a long time of not being seen at all. She said, "Can we? Is there somewhere we could go to talk?" I looked at Lauren. Lauren looked at me. Something passed between us that was complicated and old, and also, maybe, the beginning of something new. "There's a coffee place across the street," I said. I want to be honest about what that conversation was and what it wasn't. It wasn't a reconciliation scene. There were no dramatic confessions, no tearful acknowledgments, no moment where my mother said everything I'd needed to hear since I was 12 years old, standing in a kitchen waiting to be noticed. That's not how real conversations work, not between people who have spent decades building careful distances between themselves. But something happened that I had not expected. My mother talked. Not in the way she usually talked, not the surface conversation about weather and prices and Lauren's daughter's milestones, but about things I had not heard her address before, about her own mother. About the way she had understood love to be a resource that diminished if you spread it too widely, so you had to choose where to direct it most carefully. About how she had watched me growing up and found me, this was the word she used, formidable, and how that had frightened her in ways she hadn't examined. "You never needed me the way Lauren did," she said. "Lauren called me every time something went wrong. You never called." "I called," I said. "Not for help." I thought about that. She wasn't entirely wrong. I had called to share information, to report outcomes, to check in. I had not called asking to be talked through anything or held or reassured, partly because that wasn't my nature, partly because I had learned early that help wasn't reliably available from that direction. "Maybe I stopped asking," I said, because the answer was usually no. She was quiet for a long time. "Maybe," she said finally. "You're right." Lauren was crying openly by then, not dramatically. Lauren has never been a dramatic crier, just quietly with a coffee cup in both hands and mascara doing what it does in those situations. We sat there for nearly 2 hours. The coffee place filled up and emptied and filled up again around us, and we stayed at that corner table, and we talked about things we had never said out loud to each other. Not everything. Not even close to everything. But enough that when we finally stood to leave and stood for a moment on the sidewalk in the November air, something between us felt different from what it had been when we walked in. My mother reached out and touched my arm just briefly, the way you touch someone when words have run out and you want them to know you're still there. I didn't pull away. "I want to be different," she said. "I don't know how to start." "You started," I said, 3 minutes ago. I don't know how to end this story because the story isn't over. That's the honest truth of it. My mother and I are not suddenly close. We don't talk the way she and Lauren talk. We are, at this point, something more like cautious acquaintances with a shared history, feeling out the edges of a new arrangement that neither of us has a map for. She has called me 4 times in the month since that morning. Real calls, not transactional ones. Once she called to ask about my work, and we talked for 31 minutes, which is the longest we have talked since I was a teenager. Once she called to tell me about a problem at her office and asked, not exactly for my advice, but as though she wanted me present while she thought through it. I was present. Once she called just to tell me it had snowed in Greensboro and she'd looked out the kitchen window at it and thought of me. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. I knew which kitchen window she meant. I knew what it looked like from that window when it snowed. I had stood at that window myself many times, waiting for something I couldn't name. "It's pretty," I said. "Yes," she said. "It is." We stayed on the phone for a few more minutes after that, not saying much, just being there. And that, too, was something new. Lauren told me, a few weeks after the hearing, that she'd had a long conversation with my mother. She didn't tell me everything that was said, but she told me that my mother had cried, that she had said my name, not as a complaint, not in the context of the will or the house or any of the things that had built up between us, but just my name, alone, with something in her voice that Lauren said she had never heard there before. I didn't ask Lauren what that something was. I thought I already knew. The house is still mine. I drove out to it in April after everything. I hadn't been in a while. The lawn service had kept the grass trimmed and the structure was in good repair, but it had the particular stillness of a place that hasn't been fully inhabited, that is, waiting. I walked the property. I went into the barn. I sat for a while on the back porch, the way I used to sit there with Gran, watching the light come through the trees at the edge of the acreage, neither of us talking, just being in a place that felt safe. I thought about what she had written. "I want you to have a foundation because no one in this family ever gave you one." I thought about what it means to have one, not a building, not 4 acres of land outside Winston-Salem, though I am keeping those, too, for now, for reasons I can't fully articulate except that they are mine and they were hers, and that is enough. I thought about what it means to stand somewhere and know the ground beneath you is solid. I have been standing in courtrooms for years without anyone in my family understanding what I was doing there. I have been building something carefully and quietly in the way that I do everything, without asking for recognition, without announcing the work, without needing anyone to see me and say, "Good job. Well done. I knew you could." Gran saw me. That was enough. Maybe now my mother is beginning to, too. I don't need her to be everything she wasn't. I don't need the conversation to go back 23 years and repair each moment that went wrong. What I need is simpler than that and harder. I need us to begin to try, to sit across from each other with coffee between us and use honest words and see what happens next. I think we are doing that, slowly, imperfectly, with the particular awkwardness of 2 people who have been strangers inside the same family for a long time and are only now, late, trying to learn each other properly. For now, that's the most accurate thing I can tell you. Not a happy ending, not a sad one either, just a beginning, which, for the 2 of us, is more than we've had before. I checked my phone when I got back to my car that afternoon in April, the day I visited the house. There was a text from my mother, not a long one. She's not a long texter, never has been. It said, "Thinking about you today. No reason, hope you're well." I sat with that for a moment. I thought about the 12-year-old girl in the kitchen. I thought about all the years of waiting. I thought about what it costs to wait that long and what it means when something finally shifts, even slightly, even imperfectly, even this late. Then I wrote back, "I'm well. Thank you for saying so." I put the car in drive. The road back to Charlotte is long and flat, and it passes through a stretch of pine forest that smells, in April, like the very beginning of something. I drove with the windows down and the radio off, and I thought about Gran and about the letter she had left me, and about the words she had written at the very end of it. After all the practical things and all the careful explanations, she had written, "You don't have to forgive anyone for your own sake, but I hope you leave room for it anyway, not because they deserve it, because you do." I hadn't known when her attorney first handed me that letter whether I would ever be able to do that. I still don't know for certain, but I am leaving the room. That's where I am. That's what I have to offer right now. I think that's enough. Justice isn't always a gavel banging in a crowded room, and it isn't always about making someone suffer the way you suffered. Sometimes, justice is simply the truth being spoken aloud, clearly and without apology, so that the lies can finally fall away. It's about standing on a foundation that you built yourself, or that was built for you by someone who loved you enough to see you, and realizing that you no longer have to apologize for taking up space. The revenge here wasn't just winning the lawsuit. It was the quiet, devastating realization that my mother had fought a ghost. She fought a version of me she had invented in her head, a version that was weak, manipulative, and needy. She never bothered to look at the woman sitting right in front of her, a woman who was strong, capable, and formidable. The victory wasn't just keeping the house. The victory was that, for the first time in my life, I didn't need her to look at me to know that I was real. I already knew, and now she does too. If this story resonated with you, if you know what it feels like to fight for your place in the world, or if you just love seeing the truth win out in the end, please smash that like button to help others find this story. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time when you had to prove someone wrong. Did you do it with a bang, or like the narrator, with quiet precision? And make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about resilience, revenge, and the road to redemption. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.